Ugh. Ugh. Hey everybody, what I'm making in this video is a table saw bench, and what the goal for this is to make something more stable and with an outfeed table. But what I also want is for it to be able to fold down and tuck away against the wall and provide some storage, much needed storage. And what I wanted was to make it completely out of scrap wood that I already had. So this bench is obviously going to be not very pretty. It's going to be pretty ugly. But what I need is function, not pretty. And this was one of those projects that I had an idea of what I wanted to do, but no real plan to work off of, so I just made it up as I went along. The first thing I did was cut a bunch of 2x4s for the legs. I then glued 2 of them together to basically make like a 4x4, and then I cut 2 slots on each leg for the stretchers. I did this using the dado saw, taking a pass every 1/8 of an inch, and then removing the access afterwards. The reason why I did it this way was to add more strength, to make it not so wibbly wobbly, but this was also my first time building something using this method, so I used it as practice for the next project, which will be much more quality, so stay tuned for that. Anyways, I glued everything together just using my finger to spread the glue around, and then I wiped my finger on the table. Nice one. Making sure everything was a snug fit, I then used a rubber mallet to knock everything into place. Since these are just basic 2x4s, and I didn't want them to be loose at all, I made the gaps a little small, but I knew that because the wood was so soft that I could just hammer it all into place and it'd probably be fine. Side note, this was supposed to be a quick project, which ended up taking a lot longer than I wanted it to because I got called into jury duty. And I ended up being a juror for a murder trial, which took about a week or so definitely got delayed making this. But man, that was an experience. Anyways, now I don't know if you noticed, but I'm wearing one of my NCM Guitars sweatshirts. This sweatshirt is available for purchase on my website if you're interested. You can go to my website at ncmguitars.com. Link will be in the description. And that would be the quick word from my sponsor. Anywho, I didn't want to wait around for the glue to dry. So once I got everything in place, I used screws to screw it all together. Then to glue all the legs together, I clamped the entire table together first to hold everything in place. That way I could unclamp and glue one stretcher at a time, just gluing and screwing and more screwing and gluing at a nice, comfortable pace. Next thing I needed to do was add the bottom shelf, and for this I used a piece of 1/4-inch plywood, and then I used the jigsaw to notch out the corners. That way you can, seat onto the bottom? I don't know. Anyways, I probably should have put this in there before I glued the legs together because it didn't quite fit, but since the wood was so thin and flexible, I just kind of pushed it in and then used the mallet to smack it down. Then I screwed it into place. For the second shelf, I added a center brace that would help support the right side of the table saw. That way the saw is supported on both ends and there wouldn't be any sag on one side or allow the saw to bounce at all. And for the brace, I just screwed it in from the outside. Now for the actual shelf, since I was using scrap wood, I didn't have a sheet of 3/4-inch plywood big enough to cover the entire shelf surface area or whatever. So I just cut 3 smaller squares and laid them all on there, and I screwed those into place as well. Oh, careful. And since there were 3 separate pieces that I could move independently, I added another 1/4-inch piece of plywood over the top of it, just kind of giving it a little bit more structural stability, because the last thing I want is any kind of movement with the table saw on this shelf. That's dangerous, man. And again, I just used screws to tie everything together. And now it's time to move the table saw over. which was a lot lighter than I expected. I was emotionally prepared for a struggle, but I guess since it's aluminum, it was actually a lot lighter. Then I got rid of the stand, good old Facebook Marketplace. At this point, it dawned on me just how much shorter this thing is compared to the other one. Made me think of how when I was in guitar building school, one of the instructors joked around saying that he bet if I had my own workshop that everything would be low to the ground because I'm so short and had to use a step stool everywhere. And he was right. Had to be there, I guess. Alright, to go with the theme of using scrap wood, I didn't have any screws long enough to secure this thing to the bench, and rather than going to the store and spending money like a normal person, I used a piece of threaded rod that I cut and then bolted it in from both ends. Then, right here, I needed to build a support-like shelf thing for the right-hand side of the saw, and I used pocket hole screws to secure it, giving me a nice shelf to build off of. I wanted this thing to be enclosed so that it looked a little bit cleaner, so I took 3/4-inch sheet of plywood for the back of the table, and then I cut it a hole for the dust port using a jigsaw. Then I screwed it into place. I had to give myself quite a bit of space between the top of the sheet of plywood and the top of the table saw. That way the fence could freely slide without getting boogered up. And then I used a 1/4-inch sheet of plywood for the sides, screwing everything into place. But for the left-hand side, I had to leave an opening right here. That way I had access to the wrenches that are stored on the right side of the saw that are used for changing out the blades. For the tabletop surface, I used particle board because it was the hardest material I had on hand. Then to make sure it was flush with the tabletop, I used a straight edge to slide it across the saw table. Then little bit by little, I used a belt sander to remove material from the 2x4s, the frame of the saw bench, until it was flush. Now this was a lot harder than I anticipated, mostly because the table saw top was not perfectly flat, and so it caused me all kinds of problems. And it took me quite a while to get them flush. And I could have used shims to bring the saw up to the tabletop, but I didn't have the proper materials. Like, I only had that one threaded rod to secure the table saw to the bench. So I went with the hardest method I could think of. Yay for saving a buck and a trip to the hardware store. Next thing I needed to make was the Outfeed table, and I wanted to be able to fold it down. So what I used was these folding like shelf hinges. Originally I bought some cheap ones on Amazon, but after waiting a month for them to arrive, I ran out of patience. So I went to the local box store and purchased these. And they were a lot more expensive than I was hoping for. Plus, they were not the right color that I wanted. But man, these things were like $45 each. And when I was checking out, even the cashier was like, okay, your total's $174. And then she was like, whoa, I was not expecting that. And I was just like, thanks, as I inserted my credit card. Anywho, so because of the design of the table and the fence, I had to put the folding hinges lower and then build up using spacers to make the Outfeed table flush. Now, most people use routers to cut out these miter slots, but I hate using a router. Like, they scare me, so I'll do anything I can to avoid using one. What I did was cut more pieces of plywood, then glued them on top of the big sheet here, leaving gaps for the miter slots. And I used brad nails to secure while the glue dried. And right here you can see I'm double checking to make sure I can still use the miter gauge without it getting hung up on a piece of plywood. And this also added strength to the Outfeed table. At least that's what I tell myself when I go to sleep at night. I was using cheap shop plywood from the cabinets. If you saw that video, that was very soft and a little bit had a little bit of a warp to it. So by gluing these plywoods, these 2 sheets of plywoods together, it gave me about 1.5 inch thick outfeed table, and that actually helped pull the 2 sheets of plywood more flat, if that makes sense. I didn't have a big enough sheet of plywood for this last chunk, so I had to use 2 of them, which was fine. It's fine. It doesn't bother me. It's fine. Now, there was a little bit of wibble wobble on the outfeed table, so I installed this leg. This helps me when cutting heavy things so the table doesn't fall over, because when the outfeed table is all the way up, it was actually a little bit tippy, which is nightmare fuel. But anyways, that's about it. I did add an extension on the left-hand side here. That way I could cut bigger, longer pieces of wood. And I added these casters that allow the bench to sit on its legs, but then you can push them down and roll the bench around a bit. And it just folds up like so and drops down. But this thing is a tank. It is super heavy and has no wibble wobble whatsoever, which is really nice. But thanks for watching. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. I do have other videos. Check out my website at ncmguitars.com. I'm also on TikTok and Instagram. Thanks again.